Good morning and welcome to this second day of the SIPA Columbia Conference on Internet Governance and Cybersecurity, which we have undertaken in cooperation with the Internet Governance Commission and the Center on International Governance Innovation. Yesterday we focused on Internet governance matters and had a chance to talk about many remarkable and positive dimensions of the consequences of global internet and a world of exploding data, as well as some of the tensions between security and privacy, expression, innovation, and global commerce. Today we are focusing directly on cybersecurity. And of course, we all know President Obama's statements that have identified cybersecurity as one of the most serious economic and national security challenges that we face as a nation, and one, and I quote, that we as a government or as a country are not adequately prepared to counter. And cyber risk obviously affects us all, and we can experience as individuals, as corporations, NGOs, and as governments, the behavior of bad actors, and there seem to come in many different varieties, in ways that range from troublesome and expensive to potentially consequential and catastrophic. So I think it's fair to say that the regulatory and policy environment around cybersecurity is still at an early stage of development, domestically and internationally, and operationally to address the complex challenges that are arising. And we have with us today two of the most knowledgeable people in the world to think about these issues. Michael Chertoff served as Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2008, and as he amplifies in his biography, in that capacity, he led the country in blocking would-be terrorists from crossing U.S. boundaries or implementing their plans if they were already in the United States. A Harvard-trained lawyer, a former Supreme Court clerk for Justice Brennan, he was a federal judge in the Third Circuit and earlier a federal prosecutor. He now heads the Chertoff Group, where he provides high-level strategic counsel to corporate and government leaders. He's also a commissioner of the Internet Governance Commission. Now, Kevin Mandia is one of America's most expert forensic cybersecurity leaders. He's been helping organizations, private and public, detect, respond, and contain computer intrusions. And a couple years ago, when he was running a company that he founded called Mandia, he also released a report on Chinese cyber espionage that brought him and his firm, I think, to national visibility. So if you suspect that something terrible has happened or you want to guard against it, these are the two fellows that you need to call. So let me thank them both for being with us. Let me invite you to welcome them here, and we're going to ask a few questions and then open it up for your questions as well. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished experts. I'd like to first invite Secretary Chertoff to just lead us off with a few minutes of what is really top of mind for you about how we should be thinking about the whole problem of cybersecurity.
So I would say there are two elements or two things I think about in terms of the continued viability of the internet, which is now at the core of so much of our commerce and even our private lives. And one is the question is, who sets the rules? We still have the world organized with sovereign nations that want to control what goes on in their borders and want to protect or control their citizens. We have an architecture that's global, and the internet, in principle, allows connectivity across borders and without regard to borders. How do you reconcile this? That gets us into the issues, for example, of whether data ought to be localized, whether it ought to be forced to be within a particular geographic area so it can be regulated and supervised by the government of that area. That, of course, in my view, would be devastating to the value of the internet, because we would no longer have a network of networks. We'd have independent networks that were more or less disconnected. So the issue of how do we reconcile the legitimate demands of sovereignty with the architecture and the promise of the internet as a global architecture, I think is the first thing that is really challenging. The second is, how do we rebuild trust in the internet? It's a commonplace observation now that when the internet protocols were first developed, it was meant to be a way of transmitting information among networks at the Defense Department and in the government. Trust was not considered to be an issue that you had to worry about. But now, of course, the architecture is wide open. And to refer to one of my favorite cartoons, which now goes back probably about a dozen years, back when people had the big clunky PCs, it shows two dogs sitting in front of a PC, and one dog says to the other dog, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. And that's still true. So all of our interaction over the internet raises trust issues. And in particular, there are three sets of issues. One is, what is the role of government, and what should government be allowed to do? This gets us into the question of surveillance and privacy, but also, what is the government's responsibility to protect us? There are many people who say, well, look, if someone was dropping a bomb or launching a missile at the United States, we'd expect the military to respond to it. What happens if someone is sending a destructive piece of malware at an industrial control system? Does the military get involved? How do they get involved? When do they get involved? Second issue is, how do we deal with the criminals and the people on the internet who are stealing identity or stealing money? And at what point does that reach a volume that people start to disengage? I was talking to someone yesterday, and we were kidding around about the fact that we still pay most of our bills by check. And it's not just because we're old-fashioned. It's because, no one can hack into a check. So at what point does the inability to secure against criminality create actually a problem in terms of the development of the internet? And then the third area has to do with the amount of data that's being generated in the commercial realm. People think a lot about surveillance from the government standpoint, but the government has only a small amount of data compared to what the private sector has. We were talking just a little while ago, just on my trip up here for the last couple days. If I think of the number of people who took a photo of me on their phone and presumably uploaded it to Facebook or something in the cloud, then I consider the fact that no doubt the cloud also has my credit card data from where I ate. If I used a taxi cab and I used a credit card, they have that data too. Somebody could aggregate and make use of enough data to be able to pretty much tell everything I did from the time I arrived in New York until now. And that's often being monetized. Where does that lead us? Will there come a point, for example, that your ability to buy insurance will be affected by whether the insurance company approves of the kind of food you're buying in the store, or whether you're getting enough exercise as recorded by your Fitbit, which everyone's wearing around their wrist now? At some point, if you don't have an online presence, will that be held against you on the theory that, well, you must have something to hide, otherwise you would make yourself transparent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? So I think this again raises a fundamental question which will have a great deal to do with how the internet gets used and not used in the future. And finally, this will certainly magnify as we develop the Internet of Things. And more things that used to be, quote, dumb become smart, meaning that they record you and they aggregate and then they communicate. So to me, those are all very, very substantial topics.
Mm-hmm. They are indeed. Thank you very much. And lots to talk about there. Let me invite Kevin Mandia to also comment on. You get involved in actually applied problems daily, major ones. So what is top of mind for you as you think about this?
Yeah, I'm going to go tactical right away. In 2014, my organization responded to 226 different breaches where basically companies hired us to figure out what happened and what to do about it. And the conclusions to those 226 breaches were 90% of the time when a company was breached, it was the company being targeted through its people. The people were hacking themselves. So it was a spear phishing-based attack where an email would come in and say, hey, you should read this document or click on this link. And that 90%, what's remarkable about that is for the companies that didn't detect that spear phishing attack, the efficacy to detect the attack after the first inning was exponentially harder. So it was about 205 days from the moment a company was aware it was compromised from the point at which it was compromised. And that's a pretty long delta, even though it's going down. So one of the things we learned is, hey, you want to detect that first inning, that spear phishing attack, as best as possible by educating your end users to be wary of it, to report it if they get one, as well as to have technologies to look at it. Second thing we learned, but we learned this 20 years ago, there's still no risk or repercussions to attacking organizations. Quite frankly, you have an East versus West, maybe economically as well as in cyberspace. If you're hacking the United States or Western Europe from China, Russia, North Korea, Syria, I'm missing one. Russia, China, there's 5. Iran, there you go. There are no risks or repercussions. We had the privilege of responding to Iran 7 times last year. The Syrians are hacking each other to kill each other, so they're not a huge problem here in the US. The Chinese are still doing cyber espionage. I feel like it might abate over time, and we may come up with rules of engagement that are more satisfying between our nations than the Chinese hacking our private sector, just because private sector companies are doing M&A in China or litigious against state-owned entities in China. Russia, I think, has cranked it up a notch. They're harder to deal with. But while there's no risk or repercussions, what that's led to is, as I sit here today, we're responding to several dozen incidents. I'd say over 90% of those incidents are state-sponsored or nation-states behind them. If we went back 10 years, it would have been 50% nation-state attacks, 50% criminal. Nowadays, it's more nation-state. And it does impact the CISO's job when your biggest threat vector now is someone who badges in the morning in a military uniform and decides to try to hack you. It makes it hard to figure out what's the right due standard of care. Another thing we learned in 2014 is disclosures are more probable rather than less probable. If you're hacked and you know it, so does somebody else. It's my opinion there was less willful disclosure in 2014 on the major breaches you read about than willful disclosure. And what I mean by that is the timelines. No one ever gets to disclose on their own terms. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's frustrating. If you're involved in cybersecurity and you're hacked and you know it, it's a foot race to try to answer questions that you shouldn't have had to answer during the fog of war. You should have been afforded more time to solve those things. Unfortunate reality, for 20 years I could have sat here and told you, I don't really think the attackers are getting better. The unfortunate reality is in 2014, I think they did. There was evidence, at least on counter-forensics. I saw the rules of engagement change in 2 ways. It used to be if the Russians, their government hacked us, and we responded to them, they would evaporate. They would go away. They wouldn't keep hammering on the door, and you could get a 3-month respite before they'd hack back in. I would say at the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, that pattern changed, rules of engagement changed. Now if the Russian organization or Russian government hacks a US government entity, they come in every single day, they know we know, and they don't care. You know, a couple of weeks ago, Bloomberg did an article about a government agency compromised, and then Bloomberg said it's the B team from Russia. It was my opinion, I think that actually could be the A team, and they just don't care anymore, you know, that we know. So that's one difference. But the counter-forensics is remarkable to me as well, because the government, the Chinese never really did it. The Russians always did it. But I didn't expect cyber criminals to do it, but they do it now. It used to be if I wanted to hack to make money, I'd break in, I'd get credit data, and I'd try to monetize that as fast as I could with my friends and family that helped me monetize it. And then our fraud controls would step in and quash that ability over time. What we're seeing right now is even cyber criminals are doing great counter-forensics, editing log files, deleting their malware, relying on a user ID and passphrase to access your network, not their back doors. We can detect their back doors. We have a tougher time and a lower efficacy detecting them logging into our virtual private networks. So that's a problem. Checking my notes to go in order. And then the last thing I would say, and it's nice when you respond to breaches, you get the opportunity to meet CEOs, CIOs, the board level folks, And it's a shift that's been happening for the last 4 to 5 years, and it's continuing, and it continued throughout 2014, is a shift in the boardroom from governance to risk-based decisions when it comes to cyber. What we're seeing right now is a framework to report to boards is, first of all, boards actually care now. I feel every CISO used to report to a CIO or CFO. Now they're quasi-reporting to some board committee because they have to show up every quarter to brief where are we at in cyber. And what they're briefing is, here's the 5 threats that we don't want to have become a reality, and here's what we're doing about those 5 threats to make sure they don't, and here's our progress. And the governance aspect, the compliance aspect is usually just one of those 5 things, depending on the industry you're in, saying, and we consider being as compliant as possible with this reg or this ISO standard or NIST 800-53. They're seeing it as a risk if they're not deemed compliant, but not, in fact, the goal of their whole security program. So there is a shift from governance to, let's just look at this from a risk perspective. What that means, because risk profile does come from the board and the CEO and the business line owners, you're seeing top-down driven security programs now, not bottom-up, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. That's a tremendous landscape to engage. Let me ask Secretary Chertoff, do you feel there's clarity on the rules of engagement? This term was used, and I think you're using it in one sense, but in in military sense, is there real clarity on what the rules of engagement are? And how would you speak to government preparedness, I would say?
I would say there's not clarity. Now, obviously, I think most people would agree, and I think the government has published this, that espionage, theft of intellectual property would not be regarded as an active war that we would respond to as if it was a military attack. Even when we've had actual wars, spies have been caught, but we haven't treated, when the Soviets spied on us as a cause for responding militarily. On the other hand, an attack, as the government has said, an attack on industrial control systems that resulted in significant loss of life or economic damage would be regarded as an attack. Where that line is a little unclear, and the biggest challenge to me is the attribution issue. First of all, because unlike a bomber or a missile that you can pretty much tell who launched it, it's not clear necessarily who launched a cyber attack that's a destructive cyber attack. Moreover, even if we actually know who did it, the ability to prove it or explain it publicly without compromising sources and methods is very challenging. So the real question is, if there were a serious attack, and we've seen attacks, for example, Estonia in 2007, Georgia in 2008, in both cases the Russians denied that they were involved in the cyber attack. Certainly in 2007 they did. I'm skeptical because I think the Russians, as they do in the Ukraine now, often operate not under color of their uniform. But what we've seen is cases that it's a little ambiguous. And I don't think we've been completely clear about what would have to be our conclusion in order to treat something as an attack that would warrant a response. So there's a lot of murky areas in this respect. And I think, frankly, the biggest challenge for the government in the U.S. is not technical capability, but it's what the policies and rules of the game are.
Yeah. So how does the U.S. government coordinate around these issues? And where is the plan?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the way we coordinate, as we do with everything, is you have interagency groups. You have many more agencies involved here. You have the Department of Defense, which is responsible for the defense of the country, but really is focused on the military and Defense Department networks. You have the Department of Homeland Security, which is supposed to be coordinating with the private sector in terms of infrastructure. You have the Department of Justice, which does the law enforcement piece. More than in any other area of security, though, the responsibility lies with enterprises themselves. And depending on the nature of the enterprise, there can be some regulators that get involved, and to be honest, sometimes the regulators don't really understand what goes on in cyberspace, so their approach is maybe a little clunky. So you could easily have, between the SEC, the folks who regulate banks, the utility regulators, a whole group of others besides the major departments trying to coordinate. And I think one of the challenges has been, how do you centralize this in a way that gives you a strategic vision? I know Michael Daniel at the White House is the White House coordinator on this, but I don't know that he has the kind of authority you would need. I think there's a view that we ought to have something like the National Counterterrorism Center for Cyber that at least allows you to bring together a comprehensive intelligence picture of what's out there, as opposed to everybody kind of doing their own little thing.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind speaking further on the question of your assessment of preparedness.
Well, I don't know, Pine, if I'm going to put on I'm the CISO, CIO, CEO of a victim company hat. What do I want from the government? When you're hacked and you know it, it's a lonely planet, and inevitably something bad does go wrong at these companies. And I just said, if you are hacked and you know it, someone else does, and you may not be able to disclose on your own time frame, scoping the incident your own way, because things are leaking. If the Russians hack you and it's Russian criminal, half the time they're telling Western reporters and bloggers they did it, so you have two avenues of pain. You're losing money due to fraud, you're getting sued, and the world knows you've been compromised, and you're finding out the same day the world finds out. It's unfair. So if I'm a victim company, victim CEO, one of the best things the government can do is stand behind you if, in fact, it wasn't a criminal act, it was a nation state that did it. In 2014, it was the first time in my career there was a company compromised by a nation state, and then the President of the United States was the one that said, North Korea hacked Sony. That is exceptionally valuable to victim companies, because the pendulum of public opinion, if you're hacked as a major corporation by just somebody sitting down in Brazil, fat fingering and spraying and praying, it doesn't look very good, and you were probably largely irresponsible depending on the industry you're in. But if folks who badge in every day in uniform hack you, I think the pendulum of public opinion does swing to you are a victim. So the best thing we can get from the government is get attribution through one organization, get it right, and then the second thing is you can't always rely on deterrence in cyberspace. I think the United States, we're multinational organizations, we're very, very big, we proliferate our tech faster than our means to secure it, we're trend-setting R&D on the internet, and we want to own that position, which means sometimes we're out in front of our skis with the software we release and the capabilities we release. That's neat for innovation, sometimes bad for security, but we don't want to lose that edge, I don't think. What that means is that we're in a glass house sometimes when it comes to the cyber domain, that we've created some great things, but they are fragile from time to time, and we're up against folks who in the cyber domain are in a mud hut. So if we respond to North Korea in cyberspace, we're in the glass house throwing rocks at a mud hut. We're not going to win. So what I really liked what the government did is made an announcement last year. They did an executive order that insinuates the same thing, that we will respond proportionately to a cyber attack. I translated that as, we don't know what the heck the red line is in cyberspace. That would mean we respond out of cyber. We'll probably know it when we see it. It may actually depend, proportionality may depend on who's behind it. But if we get attribution right, even the ambiguity of what we're going to do if somebody hacks a U.S. organization and does something bad, that ambiguity, I do believe, has a deterrent effect to it. So that's what I want from the government, is just those two things. Give us attribution and stand behind us if we have to go public so we don't get beat up by lawsuits. I don't think you can expect most agencies to withstand attacks from military capability. I think that's unfair or unreasonable for us as a nation to do that right now at the state we're in. And then the deterrent of ambiguity is good.
I would say one thing I think would be helpful, at least when you're coming to concerns about attacks on control systems as opposed to just theft of data, is the government needs to make sure that with critical functions, we're actually thinking about the security at the beginning. I think there was a report that came out about a month ago, either from the FAA or GAO or both, about aircraft. And I've been talking about this for about a year. As you get more and more wireless connectivity, more and more sophisticated electronics on the planes, more and more people want to connect up. Are we making sure that these systems are properly segmented? I think this report suggested that maybe they're using the same platform for the entertainment as they are for flight controls. What you don't want to do is get to the day where not only can you not bring a bottle of water on a plane, but you can't bring this on a plane because this is going to become an attack weapon. So a little bit of prevention here would be very useful, I think.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the incentives. I mean, have we got the incentives right? Because, I've heard groups of information officers, security officers say that they're often afraid to investigate because of what they'll find, and that starts a chain of necessary disclosure, and it have adverse effects on stock prices and so on. That kind of thinking is very troublesome, I think. So the policy environment has got to incentivize, I think, companies, to be investing in cybersecurity and creating some sort of safe harbors. I mean, you spoke about both clarity on attribution and then second, stand behind. But the legal system doesn't stand behind. So what does stand behind mean to create a positive incentives for this?
Well, first off, any good CISO, they may be afraid to look under the hood, but you want to be the first to know if you have a problem, period. You want to be the first to know if you have cancer. You want to be the first to know if you're unhealthy. All good CISOs actually, whether they're afraid or not, and of course they're worried, but because if you find something, you're going to want to take action. But all good CISOs are, in fact, looking. That being said, my aperture probably is skewed to CISOs who care. But,
sophisticated institutions committed to this. Yeah.
But stand behind means whenever I get involved with an organization that needs to disclose, one of the nicest things, and the reason you have to do it is if you're the CEO of a company, most disclosures aren't because you're legally compelled to disclose. It's a sense it's the right thing and it's going to leak out anyway, and you want to control that leak. You want to go out to the public and say, we have had a breach. You may hear about it through whatever venue, or a reporter may just read about it. So we're going to control the feed of information. In that disclosure, there's a barrage of people that want to say you were irresponsible then. Whether you were a university, a financial service, doesn't even matter what industry you're in. Whenever you do a public disclosure that you've had a breach, you're going to see some lawsuit, usually, well over 80% of the time. That's my wag. But those disclosures, it feels good when in that disclosure to public, you get to say, and an unnamed source from the intelligence community says it was the Chinese military that hacked us, or the FBI says it was blank that hacked us. That one line could save you that lawsuit.
Uh-huh. What do you think?
I agree with Kevin, and something Kevin says sometimes, which I've often repeated, is there are two types of enterprises: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. And everybody is going to get hacked at some point unless you have nothing of value. To me, a lot of it is managing expectations. If people believe that cybersecurity means you never get breached and nobody ever attacks you, then it's a fantasy. The argument that I use, the analogy I use, is the human body. Your body is designed as the best defensive system in the universe, certainly on Earth, meaning that it keeps a lot of bad things out. It keeps bacteria and viruses out, but it's configured with the expectation that there will be bacteria and viruses that get into your system. And so your white blood cells, if it's benign, nothing happens, but if it's dangerous, your white blood cells attack it. When we vaccinate, we're essentially doing information sharing. We're sending the code of bad malicious flu viruses, for example, to our white blood cells so that they can incorporate it in the defense. Nobody thinks that you're unhealthy if you sometimes get sick, because we expect that that's part of the normal dynamic. So to me, a big part of how we have to deal with this issue of disclosure is not to be embarrassed. Now, if you haven't taken basic measures, that is embarrassing. But even if you have a robust security presence, you're going to have breaches. And a lot of the issue is going to be how quickly you respond, how quickly you mitigate it, and have you been able to minimize the consequences by the way you've architected your networks. Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of emphasis on encryption, for example, and various other ideas and remedies. What do you think has been the most effective measures that have been introduced in recent years?
I can tell you my opinion. Now I'm going to nerd out for a second. Almost every company after the Sony breach, their risk profile changed and said, we don't want people trying to wipe our stuff and we don't want people accessing high-level email. I think the biggest bang for your buck is if somebody at your organization gets spearphished, because it's tough to stop every one of those things from being successful. You don't want to have one person compromising their own system lead to your whole network being compromised. So the biggest bang for the buck to me right now would be credential management, a boring, nerdy phrase for, right now if I hack any system on most corporate networks, there's a thing called a local admin account that's actually the same on everybody's machine. So if the bad guy hacks one machine, he's going to get that local admin account that works everywhere, and they start logging in everywhere. And that's how you can propagate malware that wipes everything, or propagate malware to steal everything. So to me, the biggest bang for the buck, and it all depends on where you're at in the security maturity continuum for the right answer, but on a tactical level, make it so that if someone hacks one machine, that's all they can hack. And one of the best ways to do that is credential management. Okay. Different user ID and passphrase on each desktop, and an admin account that works everywhere that only your admin can use.
Let me ask one last question, then open it up. Possibly an apocryphal story, I will tell you. I heard the other day about an academic who was attacked by the ransom virus, was told to pay in Bitcoin, didn't know what to do. This is not a famous person. It wasn't asking for a huge amount of money, but it was meaningful to the individual. They chose to get some Bitcoin. They were then sent the key and went on with life. Who should that guy have called?
Great question. Typically, if you have an issue with a criminal extortion scheme, you're going to talk to the FBI, you're going to talk to Secret Service. Are they going to be interested in an individual's situation like this? Probably not. I mean, the reality is there's too much of that going on. And I think local police, which is the other place you would normally turn to, are just not equipped to do that. And I think that the technique that's it's pretty clever that's used by the people who are engaged in this activity is they don't ask for an exorbitant amount of money such that you can't possibly pay it. And apparently most of them are quite trustworthy. If you send it to them, they will give you
That's the example I'm
key
giving.
Because they need to, it's like a kidnapper.
That's a ransom virus.
Right, exactly. I'd like to say you could call the FBI and they're going to come, and maybe they will if they feel it's going to give them an opportunity to get into a larger network. But the reality is a lot of people are going to be on their own in this. And to be honest, some instruction about things. And then, you have to ask yourself this question. If you're worried about being locked out of your data, maybe you need to keep your data or backup of your data stored somewhere else. I mean, there are things you can do to, again, mitigate the risk.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, we can't all call you.
If you called me, it's a 5-second conversation. Pay and pray. Don't pay with credit card, pay with Bitcoin. And you can pay them $80 to decrypt it, or you can pay a firm $10,000 to figure out how to decrypt it for you. I mean, that's your math. Yeah. So a lot of security companies, most crypto lockers over time, we figure out how to decrypt them if they're very widespread. But for the ones that don't get widespread, it would cost between $5,000 to $10,000 to get your data back through a different channel. That's just an estimate. Could be more, could be impossible. But there's no good answer at that point.
Yeah. Thank you both. Let's open it up. We have tremendous expertise in the room. I see Herb Lynn. Could we wait for a microphone coming to you, please?
Hi. Herb Lynn, Stanford University. You've both spoken about the difference between nation-state activity in cyberspace, bad nation-state activity in cyberspace, and criminal activity in cyberspace. And I was wondering if either of you would care to comment on the difference with respect to Russia.
Yeah, I'd love to. The Russians, and I think in Kevin's report on China, you see a little of this too. I think the line these days between what a nation-state does and what criminal groups do is very blurry. My own view is the Russians often use criminal groups for state purposes, and I think for that reason sometimes they protect them or don't pursue them vigorously. Again, if you want a real-world example, look at what goes on in the Ukraine. The Russians don't feel constrained to wear uniforms when they carry out things. I think in the China, if you look at the report that Mandia put out a couple of years ago, you have the phenomenon of moonlighting. People who may be carrying out work during the day for the People's Liberation Army, but they're either allowed or, tacitly allowed to earn money for themselves by renting themselves out to enterprises by night. And that's what I think is a big problem for attribution. It's very hard, the Geneva Convention required, if you go into the battlefield, you have to wear a uniform. There's a reason for that. Unfortunately, that is not observed in cyberspace, and I think you get a very blurry line.
Kevin, would you care to comment further on Russia?
Yeah, I would agree. The bottom line, so nerdy language, the infrastructure or IP addresses being used to launch the nation-state attacks have overlap with the infrastructure being used to hack and steal credit data. So a lot of the TTPs that we track are starting to overlap between Russian criminal and Russian. First off, the OPSEC by Russian government's way higher than the operational security by the Chinese hacking group. So it's always harder to pierce anonymity, in my opinion, behind what could be attributed to a nation, the nation state of Russia. We know it when we see it, but we probably only have 70% of the evidence to say that we know it when we see it.
Thank you very much. Other questions? We have a cautious group in the far back place.
Hi, Robert Taryn, student here at Columbia. This is more of a private sector question, I guess. Investors seem not to be too concerned over data breaches. How do we get companies to really care about this issue when stock prices aren't responding to breaches? Thank you.
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think Target took a pretty significant hit after that breach was well publicized. Some of that may be because people perceive the liability issue. I think you're going to see more response. It's going to depend on the nature of the breach. When you get the breaches of personal identifiable information, it's actually mostly a damage that's felt and you have to get credit repair, et cetera, et cetera. It's harder sometimes for people to understand the consequence of a breach of intellectual property that winds up losing a competitive advantage. There was a company a few years ago that did a public report about their theft of intellectual property having to do, I think, with wind turbines that wound up really hurting them in the stock market because the Chinese were able to essentially leapfrog to where they had gotten through research and development simply by stealing the intellectual property. It may not even have been through cyber. It may have been the old-fashioned way. So I do think you're going to see more and more of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not convinced, and again, my aperture is probably skewed to people who care. Almost every company I meet actually does care, doesn't want to get breached. You don't want to get the flu, a company doesn't want to get hacked. The CISOs, it gets harder in small to medium businesses. I think they're sitting ducks right now if you're a small company. But for large enterprises, Global 2000, in virtually every industry, they're trying to not have a problem. They are raising the watermark on security. Quite frankly, we are better. That's why when I sat here and said, they're not hacking systems anymore because we have patch management, vulnerability management. They're hacking people now. That meant the wall, we made the Maginot Line extend, but now they're hacking people through IM, Skype, and email. So we're getting better at it. People are trying, but it's very easy to sucker punch a child on the playground. And right now, if you're a nation state, you're going to hack our large organizations. I don't think it's a fair fight right now. So that's why it's asymmetric. You got to defend 100,000 machines to 400,000 machines as a CISO, and the attacker only needs to break into one. I'd rather be on offense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Please. Professor Nye, up in the front.
Sorry. Thank you. Joe Nye, Harvard. Hackback is now illegal, but there's a bill before the House which is trying to make it legal, or is proposing to make it legal. But the term hackback itself is very imprecise. What is the line on what private actors should and should not be able to do? Honeypots are legal. What about dropping traffic? What about delays? In other words, what sort of things do we want to allow the private sector to do? We don't want full privateering for obvious reasons. On the other hand, how strict should the limits be on what's sometimes called hackback?
Great
Wanna go first,
question.
or-
I'd like to hear what you say. I've got 20 years of opinions on this one. But you go first.
I'm very, I would be very cautious about private hackback. So to me, something that, again, I want to be giving legal advice here, but to me, something, for example, you could do is if you want to have a honeypot, you want to attract malware so you can examine it, investigate it, and figure it out. I don't see a problem with that. Would I do something that's going to go back and damage a server or a network as a retaliation, I think you run legal risk with that, and I think you run the risk that you may have a lot of collateral damage that you didn't anticipate properly. So I think the idea that you're somehow, if someone burglarizes your house, you don't get to follow them home and break into their house and get your stuff back, much as you might like to do it. So to me, I'd be, active defense, which is what people sometimes call that, I'd be very cautious about that. And I also think even if it were rendered legal in the US, it might not be legal overseas. And the risk of, inadvertently taking out a hospital or something someplace else, imagine the liability. So I'm very nervous about that.
Yeah, I think hackback's off the table. You don't want the private sector doing, but going into your middle of the road, that I call that disruption. I think that's on the table because you're not impacting anybody negatively. What you're doing, the only negative impact is actually your own people, or it's invisible to all of it. And then I just wanted to comment on honeypots. Just for anyone out there thinking about an idea for let's do a honeypot, the majority of networks are already compromised. You already have a live infested honeypot called your corporate network. You have to be at the end of the security continuum. I could assess, I've assessed probably hundreds, if not thousands, of security programs. I would never recommend a honeypot till you have virtually every other safeguard your company thinks it needs, both people, process, and technology in place before I'd even do it, because it costs good resources and good time to set it up, and you may already be working in a honeypot. Second thing is, and then finally you get really, really good and you set up a honeypot. The first thing that'll happen is your honeypot does get compromised, and then it's used to hack your competitors. And then you go, now what do I do? Now I'm in plain view of data I shouldn't see, and I have a real issue on my hand. It's be careful of honeypots. One man's opinion.
So, is this leading you both to say, defense is the best offense and that's all you can do, or can you go further?
Oh, I think for the private sector, I think I agree with Kevin. You really have to think mostly defensively. I think the government could do more, and the government can do offense. Now they have to make a judgment, as with any other government action, whether there are some collateral consequences as well. I think I would anticipate in the area of criminality, it's likely to be a law enforcement response. Now, can we do a better job of getting other countries to work with us on responding? I think the answer to that is yes. And maybe we need to use more of our trade tools and things of that sort to do that. I think when you get to things that are not disruptive like DDoS attacks, but something that would be destructive, yes, there are things I think the government could do. You get into the issue of how imminent does the threat have to be? Can you prevent things before they occur? And I think that's going to depend a lot upon what you envision the adversary's intent is going to be. So this is part of that rules of engagement discussion, which I think is ongoing.
Could you say a little bit more about where you think the cooperation is robust between the United States and other countries in the world?
I think it's, so separate different things. Capabilities are different. I think we have, generally good cooperation with Europe, although to be honest, the Europeans, because of some of their privacy rules, won't do some of the things that we would do in order to detect problems in the network. I don't think we have, the Russians always talk about wanting to have a treaty. I guess you've picked up, I'm a Russia skeptic. And certainly, as we've talked about in the criminality area, I'm not sure that they're particularly cooperative. Some of the Eastern European countries, I think, lack the capability. They'll try to cooperate and they can be somewhat cooperative. A big area is with China. There's been a lot of dialogue. The president had it with, President Xi. I was over there a couple of years ago with the Chamber of Commerce. There's been a lot of resistance to clamping down on the intellectual property theft over there. Nevertheless, I do think there are some areas we could achieve cooperation with the Chinese on, maybe on rules of engagement in warfare. I don't particularly think the Chinese government's looking to steal my credit card data, so there might be some criminal elements where we could reach an agreement. I do think it's one of these issues, and it goes to the governance question too. At some point, we're going to have to decide, do we really want to have the internet flourish as a global engine, or do we not want it to have that? Do we want to break it up? And to be honest, I think there are some countries who would rather break it up because their view is that the risk of dangerous, quote, ideas is so great that even if they lose economic benefit, they rather keep, what they consider to be politically undesirable information out.
Let me ask you one more question. I understand that Russia and China have entered into some sort of treaty around this. What do you think they do under that treaty?
I can't say I'm that into the details of that. I think right now there's a lot of, frankly, maneuvering around between the two of them vis-a-vis the United States to kind of make a show to the world. I still think both countries will proceed with their interests. I think if the Chinese see intellectual property in Russia of value, and they may not, they'll steal it. I think right now there's not a lot of antagonism. I think Putin's very focused on Europe and pressing there. But I think if there was some issue where they got into a conflict, you could easily see a conflict breaking out. So I view it as an opportunistic relationship, not one that's an enduring one.
Perhaps could I invite you to speak to your sense of either scope for cooperation internationally or even with foreign-based corporations who are experiencing problems?
Lots of comments, but I can tell you if we all signed a treaty on rules of engagement in cyberspace today and every sovereign nation pen and inked it, we'd all be cheating before the ink dried. So nothing's going to change. But I do believe you're going to see largely East versus West alignment there. It'll ebb and flow. I'm hopeful. I mean, it's going to go unabated till there are risks or repercussions to the threat actors. If there are safe harbors where you can just launch attacks and spray and pray till they work, it's going to continue. But I am hopeful. I think we're going to have a dialogue with China that's probably going to change the rules of engagement there because it's important for everybody. We'll never get to perfection, ever. We'll get to B plus every once in a while, then go sinking down to D. And it's been worse than it is today. We're not in the trough right now in cyberspace. In my opinion, we're coming up from the trough. Because now most attacks we're seeing are actually nation-state attacks. The criminal ones, our defense has gotten better, I think, and it's making it harder. And the nice thing about criminal attacks is the infamous adage that if you're faster than your buddy, the bear eats your buddy. All you have to do to avoid some of the criminal element is be better at security than 100 other companies. And the challenge with nation states is the bear's chasing just you, and you have no one else for it to gobble up along the way. So we've gotten better, and I can see that in the incidents we're responding to. But it's never going to go away. It's here to stay, and more importantly, the next conflict, no matter what, there will be a geopolitical conflict somewhere in the world. There's always going to be a cyber component to it. What makes it neat and unfortunate, but I think it's more neat, is the next conflict, whether armed or ideological, is going to have this cyber component, and it will pervade from the military government world into the consumer space in weird and funny ways. You may have your refrigerator 5 years from now order 20 gallons of milk on you. It's because the asymmetrical combat of this, we can win kinetically in so many ways. I think that all conflicts going forward will have bizarre consumer impact.
Any further questions from our audience? Professor Bellevin.
I'm curious what you see as the goals of the nation-state attackers other than theft of intellectual property.
I think what you're seeing potentially is positioning for the possibility of a hot conflict by being able to have tools in place that would allow you to disrupt, at a minimum, the command and control system of your adversary. And I think the Chinese, there have been open publications. The Chinese talk about information warfare. I mean, whether it's air-sea denial or even doing things in your adversary's home country that are disruptive and create distractions. So I think that, and I think both, if you look at, go back to the Iraq wars, both in '90 and 2003, the tremendous advantage we had with smart weapons, I think, clued other countries into the fact that the battlefield domain may have to be in cyberspace and communications and things of that sort. So that's what I think the ultimate game plan is here. And that Georgia's a great example. In 2008.
Kevin, are you in full agreement with that, or do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. The great thing about being a cybersecurity guy is every once in a while I can just punt and go, hey, I can't speculate and read minds. I've responded to intrusions, and my people have responded to intrusions where I sit here and have no idea what the goal was, none. And I don't even think it was a hack of opportunity. They worked hard to break in. I can tell you over the last 3 years, we've found about 30 zero-day attacks. That's an estimate, somewhere around 30. The one pattern I am noticing is the zero-day attacks that are being found by nation states. I mean, there's no patch, the attack's gonna work. It's not a carpet bomb with the zero-day anymore, which is great for security professionals. It's pinpoint against specific industries. So I can tell you certain industries, why they're targeting them. If you have to feed 1.7 billion people and keep them healthy, there's a couple industries you're gonna target. But every once in a while I respond to a breach and I'm confounded, absolutely confounded by why they take, who's taking it. I can't marry with what they're taking and why.
And who do you call
When?
in such circumstances? I mean, if attribution is, if you're puzzling on attribution and you're not a critical industry,
Right.
Where do you go?
Most companies, if they've been breached and they need attribution behind the breach, there's a company called iSight Partners, there's our company, there's Dell SecureWorks, there's a company called CrowdStrike. You go to them all. If you really need attribution, you'll go to, till you get an answer, and if you don't get an answer, you're still talking to the FBI. You'll go to the FBI and get something. But you do want to know who's behind it, because that does help you understand what the remedial steps would be, and it helps you posture your response if you have to disclose.
Thank you very much. Last question here.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. For me, when I looked at the Snowden revelations, one of the most disturbing things that came out was that the US government had been subverting the development of encryption standards and other technologies by having people in the standards process pushing for technologies they knew were weaker so that American agencies could subvert them. Do we have any evidence that other countries are doing similar things? The Chinese are much more involved now in internet standards bodies, and how do we ensure that the standards that are being used worldwide are as secure as they need to be? And a related question is, how do we ensure that other countries are not subverting the open source software development process to insert weaknesses that will then be deployed in hundreds of millions of computers?
Well, first of all, I don't want to assume that what Snowden said is correct or not exaggerated. I think in general, the issue about whether people subvert open source software or if they see something but they don't reveal it is part of the debate going on. I have no reason to believe, for example, the Russians wouldn't, if they were aware of something, exploit it and not reveal it. Now, we do produce, a lion's share of this in the U.S. and the West, and so I suppose in that sense, it's more likely we're going to have the opportunity. My view is we should not compromise or fail to reveal problems in software, because I think that the vulnerability it creates is too great. Now, if there was a particular device that was going to a foreign adversary, I wouldn't have a problem compromising that device. But I think generally, this is a strategic decision we have to make. And it's true in a wide variety of areas. In the intelligence world, those responsible for offense always have one set of priorities, and those responsible for defense have another set. And the adults, meaning the policymakers, are supposed to reconcile those. And I think, again, my personal view is you shouldn't allow a general compromise of security because it might have some offensive value, but you could target an individual device or some individual network if there was, some strategic reason to do so.
Yeah, the upside of that, just a quick comment, all the zero days are going against usually relatively hardened targets though. So if you're the Russians or the Chinese, and that's where we're seeing the zero days come out of, unless it's us or the Israelis, when we see zero days, it's government on government still, for the most part, or it's government against defense industrial base, where the watermark for security is high enough. It's not getting spoiled on every industry when you have an attack that works very efficiently. At least right now, that's the current trend.
Thank you very much. I think we've gone a little bit beyond our allotted time, but it's been an important conversation and hugely valuable to all of us. Thank you very much for being with us.